Joining me now, Joshua Keating is a senior editor at Slate. So Joshua, this election largely centered around Brexit, but before the vote, you say the stakes could actually be even higher. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, well, it's sort of unthinkable to think that the United Kingdom could actually no longer remain united, but that is really what we're facing, and the results showed that. I mean, the SNP had an extremely good night in Scotland, taking 48 out of the 59 seats in Scotland, and for the first time ever, Northern Ireland actually has more nationalists, meaning those who want to see united Ireland, than loyalists who support remaining with the UK in its parliamentary delegation. So, between that and the fact that a lot of British conservatives don't really seem that committed to keeping the union together anymore, I think that the idea of a kind of split of this union is not as far-fetched as it used to be.
So it's incredible because Johnson got this incredible victory. Sturgeon's party has been unwavering about wanting to remain in the EU. What does their success in Scotland signal to you?
I mean, it signals to me that there are a fair number of Scottish voters who may have voted for the SNP but don't actually favor independence. The SNP took a unambiguous stance in opposition to leaving the EU as opposed to the Labour Party. So there might be some Labour Party voters who went over to the SNP because of that, rather than because they actually favor Scottish independence. So, I think that the SNP leadership is not going to let this go. They're going to continue to demand this referendum, and then they're in a pretty strong position to do so now. I think whether that referendum would actually pass is another question.
So Northern Ireland's fate was really uncertain under Johnson's Brexit plan. What do you think happens now?
So it's been interesting. The Johnson has taken a lot of credit for negotiating this new withdrawal agreement with the EU, which a lot of skeptics said that he wouldn't be able to do. I think that's not so much because he's so charming or because his negotiating skills are so impressive. It's because he was willing to cross one of the red lines that Theresa May never would, and is essentially leaving Northern Ireland under EU customs rules. So what that basically does is it creates an economic border down the Irish Sea and leaves Northern Ireland under different customs rules than the rest of the UK. And this is something that really enraged the loyalist parties, the unionist parties that had been backing him in Northern Ireland, and they were punished for it on election night. The DUP, which had been his main coalition partner, had a very bad night, whereas the main nationalist party, Sinn Féin, which used to be known as the political arm of the Irish Republican Army, had a very good night and picked up some seats. So, I think that there were a lot of concerns during the Brexit negotiations that a hard Brexit could endanger the Irish peace process. And, what we saw was that the conservative parties were willing to risk that. British conservatives have become so fixated on Brexit that they're willing to risk the hard-won peace in Northern Ireland. And I think that people in Northern Ireland aren't going to forget that.
So Boris Johnson had promised Brexit in his first 100 days if re-elected. What do you think this means for the future of really the entire United Kingdom at this point?
So I think there are two main takeaways. One, the uncertainty around whether Brexit's going to happen is gone. I think even as recently as a month ago, it was possible to imagine a scenario where there was another referendum on Brexit. That probably would have happened if Jeremy Corbyn had been elected. That election could have resulted in Brexit being called off altogether. Now that uncertainty's gone. The UK is, barring an unforeseen event, is going to be out of Europe on January 31st. And that's what he promised. What happens after that's a little uncertain because they still have to negotiate a new trade deal with the EU. And he says he can do it in 11 months. At this point, it would be foolish to bet against him, but it's going to be a lot more complicated than what they're promising. The other big thing that happened in this election was a real redrawing of the British political map. We saw, areas in northern England, as your package said, that have never voted conservative before or haven't in almost a century, now voting conservative. This was a very unusual election. Brexit kind of hovered over everything. Jeremy Corbyn was a uniquely unpopular Labour leader. There are a lot of people who maybe weren't so sure about Boris Johnson, but were just uniquely uncomfortable with him. I think the question now is whether Johnson can turn these gains into a more kind of permanent redrawing of the British political map, or whether this is sort of a fleeting, one-time only scenario.
Joshua Keating, I want to thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.